Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to the third roundtable. I'm Nicole Bourbonnais, Associate Professor of International History and Politics here at the Graduate Institute. And I'm joined today by Tiffany FLORVIL, Alex Lichtenstein, and online, oh, she just disappeared. We had her. Nicole CUUNJIENG ABOITIZ. Nicole is a research fellow at Clare Hall, University of Cambridge, where she supervises in world history and is executive director of the Toynbee Prize Foundation. Her research focuses on global intellectual history and Southeast Asian environmental and cultural history, and her first book is Asian Place, Filipino Nation, A Global Intellectual History of the Philippine Revolution, published in 2020 with Columbia University Press. Tiffany is an associate professor of 20th century European women's and gender history at the University of New Mexico. She specializes in the histories of post-1945 Europe, the African diaspora, social movements, Black internationalism, and gender and sexuality. Her book just came out as well, Mobilizing Black Germany, Afro-German Women, and the Making of a Transnational Movement, published by University of Illinois Press in 2020. And finally, Alex is professor of history at Indiana University, Bloomington, and former editor of the American Historical Review. And he's written widely on topics of race, labor, and politics in the United States and South Africa. And his most recent book, written with his photojournalist brother, Andrew Lichtenstein, is Marked, Unmarked, Remembered, A Geography of American Memory, published in 2017. Nicole, can you hear us okay? Yes, okay, good. So in this panel, we're focusing on the subject of race and nationalism. As you're aware, both race/racism and nation/nationalism have in recent years been on the forefront of public debates in the US and Britain in particular, but also in other places. But historians' predilections have tended to take different trajectories. So while the historical study of nationalism really peaked in the 1990s and early 2000s and has declined since, the study of race and racism has become increasingly popular in the 2000s, particularly in places where it had previously been marginal outside of the United States. So our first question to consider today is, do you agree with this view of the broad development of the fields? Considering how closely related race/racism and nation/nationalism are in present-day political debates, what explains the trajectory of scholarly attention to this phenomena? Maybe I'll start with Alex for this question, and then Tiffany can go ahead.
Okay, good. Thank you, Nicole, for that introduction. So, and thank you, Michael, for inviting me, and thank you all for the really stimulating discussion this morning. And I've just been signaled to take off my mask. So, let me preface this by pointing out that, strictly speaking, I am not a scholar of nationalism, at least not directly. In part, I'm joining you today because of my editorial or former editorial role at the American Historical Review, in which I worked with Michael and many of his collaborators, I think almost all of whom are here. And in fact, I believe this conference began by growing out of a series of short papers that Michael and Sandrine and Fred Cooper and about a dozen people participated in crafting on many of the issues surrounding nationalism, and that will be published in the AHR, assuming my successor agrees with me, which I think he does in the coming year. And so Michael very graciously invited me here, at least ostensibly at the beginning, to comment on those papers in a roundtable. That moment has passed and was done remotely, but I still thought it would be worth coming and discussing this. So to the first question, as someone who works on the history of the United States and on South Africa, particularly 20th century South Africa, the first question actually makes no sense to me, right, given my historiographical interests. Race and nationalism have been inseparable historical phenomena in both of these contexts, of course. In South Africa, for example, 20th century history in particular has been shaped by racially based nationalisms and their competing imperatives and fractures. On the one hand, the creation of the South African state and nation in the first place, with Union in 1910, was quite explicitly a white nationalist project. Interestingly enough, that vision was embedded ideologically, rhetorically, and even architecturally in the notion of racial unification. But that doesn't mean what you might think it means. In that case, the seat of government, the Union buildings in Pretoria, which still are there and still are the seat of government, were designed by Sir Herbert Baker with two broad sweeping wings that were symbolic of the coming together of two competing races in southern Africa to create a new nation, Boers and Englishmen, not Africans, two symbolically competing races that were both white in the lingo of the time. Even that soon proved insufficient, despite appeals to the white nationalist ideal of unification by that great internationalist, Jan Smuts, who's an interesting figure in this regard. Despite his own appeals to that white nationalist ideal, an explicitly racial Afrikaner nationalism unseated that vision and eventually triumphed in the immediate post-war period to institute apartheid. Again, it's crucial to recognize that that racial nationalism was constituted as much in opposition to the British Empire and to Englishness as it was in opposition to Africans. The latter, of course, in their own struggle for rights in South Africa, turned to their own competing ideals of nationalism, some of them racially based. Pan-Africanism, for example, others ethnically specific. Zulu nationalism, which had a hold and continues to have a hold, given recent events in South Africa, on people's nationalist imaginations. And ultimately, the triumphant and more universalist nationalist vision of Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress under the banner of non-racialism. Talk about something that's constructed in contradistinction, as we were talking about this morning. But even that ideology of non-racialism embedded in the post-apartheid South African state, at least ideologically, has shown considerable cracks over the past quarter century and was far less hegemonic than the triumphant African National Congress and its international and internationalist allies pretended to imagine. So from my perspective, historiography of nationalism and of racialism are intertwined entirely. So that's given the fields that I'm attached to. Thank you.
So maybe I'll come next to Tiffany. Go ahead.
Yes, I too would like to thank Michael for the invitation, and it's been quite generative so far, the roundtables, and I look forward to the remainder of the roundtables as well as the keynote. So I also come at this sort of particular question as a scholar who's also, much like Alex, not a scholar of nationalism and nations. I sort of consider myself a scholar of race and racism, but also not so much. Mostly a scholar of the African diaspora and Black studies, which, much like Alex said, are deeply intertwined in terms of how we discuss nation, how we discuss racialization, how we discuss processes of othering. So all of this is deeply connected. For me in particular, I see a really useful way of thinking about scholars who are working, or excuse me, historical actors who are framing a discussion about themselves vis-a-vis the nation, especially their exclusion from the nation. So they're talking about their subjectivities, their creation of new identities, new intellectual/affective communities in the process. And this is a direct response to race and nation building. So nation building is premised on the idea of excluding others. And so there's a reframing of how, sort of, for example, I look at my study. My interlocutors are Black Germans, so individuals of African diasporic descent, individuals who are oftentimes sort of American or African migrants who are coming also to Germany. All of them are framing their identity, their different political practices and agendas in a response to how they're excluded from the national polity. So that in itself is their engagement with these sort of debates about nationalism and nation building. And in particular, as Nicole just mentioned, I recently published a book, and in the book I really talk about how Black Germans are articulating claims of belonging in the nation, but also premised on their connections to people outside of the nation. So they're forging connections outside of the nation that's extremely fruitful for them, and how they can reimagine their position and place in the German nation. And for many of them, it is really this idea, this rooted this rooted internationalism that doesn't necessarily need to transcend the borders, even if they do transcend the borders. So what I'm talking about is sort of this grassroots internationalism that really helps them shape their ideas about the nation, and conversely helps them shape their ideas about what the nation is not for them, what the nation is unable to provide for them. And so for me, I don't see them as disconnected or disparate, especially thinking about the German tradition of like this new imperialist studies of the 1990s. We're really talking about nation building in the nation and race. They were never sort of disparate fields. Sort of really thinking about these sort of scholars who are really saying, look, we really need to reconsider German colonialism in these terms and in these ways. So I don't see them as disparate at all, and I see them inextricably linked. But even though they're so inextricably linked, I scudder at the idea of being called a scholar of nationalism. I'm not a scholar of nationalism. Yikes. That's not a bad thing, so I probably shouldn't have said yikes. But I just think, just in terms of how my historical actors and my interlocutors they're not using nationalism as an organizing characteristic. They are using a sort of exclusionary, an exclusionary German nationalism. So they know that Germans are excluding them from the national polity, both politically and culturally. But they're not necessarily talking about talking about their demands in a nationalistic way. They're sort of countering the German nationalism that's basically excluding them and imposing another identity or another sort of positionality on them. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Tiffany. Nicole, you wanted to pass on this one, right? Or did you want to jump in? We can't hear you.
You're muted.
We still can't hear you.
Are you muted?
Okay, well, I'll move on to the next question then while they figure that out, and then you can come back to this.
But it looks like the problem is not in the Philippines.
Yes.
The volume is on at this end, it looks like it. Can you turn on the transcription? We can't hear you still, Nicole. We can see your lips moving.
Okay.
Oh, we just heard you.
We can hear you. Yeah. Oh.
Yes.
There you are.
I can briefly answer actually, if that's all right. I mean, I'll keep my answer to this prompt brief because my thinking on this is quite simple, really. At least in the context of Asia, and I've got quite a good deal more I want to say for the following two prompts, which is why I was saving my time, which is why I've been asked up this. But it seems we're looser on time than I had thought. So to answer this question about the differing trajectories for the historiographies of race and nationalism, I think the central insight of recent histories of anti-colonialism is instructive. And by this I refer to the insight that the racialized geopolitical arena in which anti-colonial nationalisms vied rendered the unit of the nation-state insufficient to address an international reality of material inequality or the long racial lines. That being said, for the colonized, no strategy could afford to be purely transnational or global because of the realities of local oppression. And after a certain point, as we've noted, nationalism was the only option on the table. Yet, of course, any such victory on a national frame would always remain tenuous and incomplete because emancipation was racial and international. So the anti-colonialism is the transnational part, and the national part is what relates to a more localized politics of place. So from this frame and from this insight, you have two sides of the coin. The nation can relate to aspirations within a politics of place, if not of localities or locals, and race relates to struggles within the global and international. So from my viewpoint within Asia, the rise of transnational, international, and global histories more recently have supported the inherently transnational character of studies of race and given it greater purchase and explanatory prominence, if not funding, within the academy. That said, I do not see any dying down of the intersection of the two, echoing the prior two panelists, but it seems that anecdotally in Asia, that they usually come with a third factor. So you have no shortage of studies that have XYZ, race, nation, and gender, security, sexuality, or culture, but a waning of studies of just the two, race and nation. So perhaps if the global trend has spurred and supported studies of race, while the social scientific turn has sort of spurred a turn towards intersectionality that's kept alive nation, but only in conjunction with race and a third, at least in the Asian context.
Thanks, Nicole. So we'll move on to the next question. We can come back and discuss, of course, any of these points in the larger conversation. So the next question asks how notions of nationhood have historically been racialized. Nicole, you've done this with a view to turn of the century Filipino nationalism in conjunction with Pan-Asianism. Tiffany, you've analyzed how dominant understandings of German nationhood inherently rested on whiteness and how women of African descent struggled to carve out an Afro-German identity. Alex, you've focused on intersections between struggles for racial justice and labor history, and on the complex ways in which traumatic events in the American past are memorialized. So how would you summarize the cumulative contribution that this scholarship has made to our understanding of nationalism? Maybe we'll go backwards this time and start with Nicole, and then Tiffany, and then Alex.
Sure. So focusing on the insight of this scholarship as it relates to racialized Asian nationalisms, especially in Southeast Asia, I wish to highlight, I guess, firstly, the entanglement of the national and transnational through racialized understandings of the international and of imperialism, and secondly, the positive functions race has played in the construction of Asian nationalisms in Southeast Asia. So at the end of the 19th century, the global advance of Western imperialism, both in action and concomitant intellectual infrastructure, racialized the international sphere. And this gave succor to theories of social Darwinism that arrayed the world into racial camps, making forms of regional federalism seem necessary and natural to constituent Asian nation-states' existence and survival. As a result, dualistic internationalist experimentation attended the late 19th and 20th century rise of the nation-state as the legitimate political form in Southeast Asia. Many turn-of-the-century Filipino thinkers and revolutionaries grounded anti-colonial political legitimacy in supposedly inalienable understandings of localized place and nation, but like their Vietnamese neighbors, among others, they fortified such national groundings within wider racial camps, which were assumed to share various interests, if not outright civilizational destinies. And the perceived need in colonized Southeast Asia to alloy one's otherwise localized anti-colonial nationalism with transnational racial solidarity was due in part to the belief in a coming race war. In Asia, this racialized geopolitical interpretation resulted from a social Darwinist reading of the nature of power and of imperialism and the contemporary alignment of racial lines and material and technological inequality, with the exception of Japan. Social Darwinist Peter Kropotkin emphasized mutual help among members of a species as crucial to the species' survival in nature. And for Asian intellectuals who had internalized social Darwinism as an explanation of difference among nations rather than of inequality existing within a single nation, as it was originally theorized, Kropotkin's argument served to bridge social Darwinism and Pan-Asianism. So with regard to the dualistic nature of Asian anti-colonial nationalisms, the argument that nationalism and internationalism were existentially entangled in the colonized Asian periphery at the turn of the 20th century should come as no surprise. Christopher Hill interrogated their simultaneous emergence and even entanglement in the global centers of Japan, France, and the US in the same period. But does Southeast Asian anti-colonial dualistic nationalism have something to contribute beyond rearticulations of the contingency of the nation-state? By this I refer to the argument that the nation-state is a contingent historical creation, so we should not teleologically presuppose its formation when we look in the past. Yet in Southeast Asia, transnational racial solidarity ultimately served nationalist movements and aims rather than vice versa. So does Southeast Asian anti-colonial dualistic nationalism actually cut away at the non-teleological argument about the contingency of the nation-state? So as mentioned earlier, Southeast Asian dualistic nationalism was the fruit of the region's racialized geopolitical competition. And basically, the entangled goals of Asian anti-colonial nationalism traffic necessarily in nation and race and were both national and transnational. But further than that, beyond the negative victory of emancipation that was aspiring toward, race and racial transnationalism served positive roles. So firstly, race served a positive function in the anti-colonial argumentation for and construction of nations, particularly in the colonized periphery of Asia. For example, in the Philippines, the visible lack of ancient kingdoms or ruins around which to assemble and specify a nation made claims to civilization and historical grandeur through a blanket concept of race seemed necessary. And anti-colonial nationalisms formed in the interstices of the colonized and colonizers' imaginaries. So it's no surprise that while often arguing against or subverting the Western epistemologies arrayed against them, the colonized also integrated those epistemologies into their anti-colonial nationalism. And European Orientalism's statements of difference between East and West obtained not only as intellectual planks supporting Western imperialism and racism, but also positively as the foundations for Asia's unique role within a shared universal history of civilization. Peripheral Filipino-Asianists advanced a unitary concept of civilization in order to do this, and it was housed alternately in East and West, indifferent to where it landed. They then claimed a place in this universal history through a geographic construction of the Asian race that generalized an ancient Chinese grandeur and made it racially available to their nationalism. Secondly, and lastly, Pan-Asianism and the example of Meiji Japan, through their assertion of the unique fruits of Asian culture and proof of successful Asian modernization, supported the legitimacy and perceived viability of Asian nationalists' claims of rightful sovereignty over their countries in spite of their country's relative failure in a social Darwinist geopolitical competition. But the content of the Pan-Asian imaginary and the proposition in the colonized periphery was not merely a new strategy within the same social Darwinist struggle. The peripheral Pan-Asianists asserted that the Asia within Pan-Asia would embody a rightful moral grounding to geopolitics, which they took as lacking in the international sphere and asserted was Asia's unique offering, pitting a materialist West against a spiritualist East. Within this framework, Pan-Asianists were often ambivalent about the imperial potential embedded in Asianist alliance, highlighting instead its new vision of diplomacy.
Thanks, Nicole. Tiffany, go ahead.
So once again, I sort of study Black German historical actors who in many ways use this idea of the nation to describe why the nation is implicit, very much a part of this sort of larger racecraft of German nationhood. So they call out previous practices of racialization and difference, Germany's colonial legacy, all of these in an effort to talk about the legacies of German nation building and state building and what that means for consolidating power and, quite frankly, for excluding a variety of others that we've seen has shifted across time and space in the German context. So for them, the nation is an exclusionary polity that is premised on difference. And for Black German actors in particular, they're really talking about whiteness and how whiteness functions in the German context, and that it's had a variety of functions in the German context from the 19th century onward, and many could articulate even further. And so they really are talking about how whiteness is a racialized category, how race is not fixed, how all of these understandings of German identity, German citizenship, are very much tied to a colonial past. German notions of German national identity is tied to the 1913 citizenship law that was created in the colonial setting. So what Black Germans are doing in the 21st century and in the 20th century is really calling attention to how German nation building processes were explicitly racist, and that they've never not been racist. And so this is very clear in the post-45 period too. So the subjects, the interlocutors that I'm focusing on are very much in the 1980s and 1990s, which many people are like, what is that, history? Are you sure? Very much so. And they really see themselves as sort of really calling attention to the legacies of race, even in a context where both East Germany and West Germany have enshrined in their constitutions that, everyone is equal in the law. And so Black Germans on both sides of the wall are articulating claims that no, that's not true. That race has remained even, although race has been sort of invisibilized in many ways in the German context, it still remains hyper visible in how these individuals have been perceived and how other minority groups in Germany have been perceived. So thinking about the Roma, thinking about Turkish Germans, thinking about Mozambican workers in the East, and also thinking about Angolan workers in the East. So all of these racializing, these ideas of sort of racial difference are premised on the sort of exclusionary racecraft that Germany has fashioned throughout the centuries. And for them, it's really important to stress that, and they stress that through a variety of ways, which is why I think of sort of Black German activists as very much sort of intellectual, everyday intellectuals, quotidian intellectuals, who are really pushing different ways of knowing about a German past. That doesn't necessarily mean that these, quotidian intellectuals are acquiring a claim. Some are sort of nobodies, and so when we think about this, but undergirding their goals is this idea about how we sort of create this knowledge for a larger German public, in which they recognize the centrality of race in these varying contexts. And so at all of these activities that sort of Black German interlocutors are sort of organizing, sort of workshops, seminars, art exhibitions, hip hop, all of these sort of forms are ways of disseminating knowledge and ideas about the centrality of race in these sort of contexts, specifically sort of colonialism onward. And so I think for me, the nation is there in terms as an exclusionary state, and Black Germans are responding to the sort of legacy of this exclusionary state and how it's impacted them and other minority communities in the German context.
Thanks, Tiffany. Alex, go ahead.
Thank you. So from my perspective, it shouldn't come as a surprise that the scholarship on racialized nationalism has been absolutely central to my thinking and to much of the scholarship in South African and U.S. history, and much of that scholarship has actually generated some of this thinking. The South African case is rather obvious. Afrikaner nationalism explicitly and unabashedly declared itself a white nationalist project, indeed was proud of its status as the last white nationalist redoubt in the face of international opposition well into the 20th century. In the United States, the same really can be said for Confederate nationalism, right? The strident denials of that fact today notwithstanding. Increasingly, I think U.S. historians and some U.S. citizens need to recognize the idea that what is traditionally regarded as national identity in the United States, the founding of the nation, the winning side in the Civil War, westward expansion, global engagement, all of these things that define national identity in the United States, those things, of course, have also been a white nationalist project. Some examples stand out in the historiography, the literature on immigration, that recognizes that incorporation into the polity often had more to do with whiteness and whitening than it did with a particular kind of citizenship. The role, and this I think increasingly is where the historiography is going, the role of policing in enforcing white nationalism, dating all the way back to the slave patrols of the 18th and 19th century, through Jim Crow, lynching, the imposition of the death penalty, mass incarceration, and sadly recent events in the United States. All of these things can be understood as a long thread of white nationalist identity in the United States. And finally, of course, the recent debates over the 1619 Project and the anxiety that that's produced, that is the notion that the country's founding and its national identity should be tied up with the history of enslavement of Africans, the desperation with which many Americans have met that, and the insistence in clinging to a nationalist mythology embedded in white supremacy in 1776 is also indicative of how deeply rooted these things are. And before passing the baton or the mic back, I actually wanted to ask a question for later for Tiffany. I'm curious whether the presence of South African exiles in the DDR in the 70s and 80s as part of the ANC, whether that had any kind of impact on Black German identity, where you had a Black internationalist infusion. Yes, you also had Mozambican guest workers, but the South Africans who were there were explicitly supported by the DDR as kind of an internationalist revolutionary force to overthrow apartheid. So I wonder how that figures into the story that you tell. I'd be very curious. So thank you.
Tiffany, do you want to respond to that now or wait?
I'll hold off.
Hold off. Okay, take some time and think about it. And we'll go to the last question that we have, which is nationalism scholars have long had a tendency of organizing thematic journal issues, seminars, or conferences on the basis of coupling nationalism with something else. So nationalism and religion, nationalism and globalization, nationalism and sexuality, similar to the roundtables here. If you think of nationalism and race/racism as one such possible coupling, how would you delineate its distinctiveness? Does it have a distinctive story to tell about A, the relationship between methodological nationalism and historiography and the historical study of nationalism, and or B, the longevity and recent revival of nationalism? Maybe Tiffany will go to you first, and then Nicole, and then Alex.
Yeah, these are great questions. I pondered what I should sort of say in terms of the relationship to my own work and this. So for me, I think what's been exciting about some of the new scholarship on nationalism is this idea of really concretizing what white nationalism means, what that means in a European context, and certainly what that means in the U.S. context. But in a European context, I see it really, and although we sort of can think about the early modern period or the medieval period as forms of like pre-racial communities and pre-modern, nations, I think we see the seeds of how racial difference was fashioned and formed. And I see that these new methodological projects are really pushing what whiteness can mean over a variety of spaces and times. That whiteness itself as a category has changed. We've talked about how blackness and the other has changed, but we oftentimes don't necessarily think about whiteness as a category changing over time and who had access to whiteness. Situational whiteness emerges in the colonial settings, especially when we think about Latin America in some ways. So I think for me, it's been fruitful to see how whiteness as a category and white nationalism, quite frankly, are really popular. And this is certainly the case when we see the sort of populist movements across Europe on the rise and what that means for these notions of nationalism. Simultaneously, I think that for scholars of the African diaspora and sort of Black studies scholars more broadly, they're really articulating what a Black nationalism means, also across time and space. So one that certainly changes in different contexts. So there's certainly a distinction between Black nationalism in the 1970s in the US and a type of Black nationalism that emerges in the UK in the 1960s and 1970s. There's some linkages, of course, but also some distinctions. And so I think that's a useful, that's a secondary sort of useful approach in the scholarship. So we have this overarching approach to whiteness and white nationalism. Then we have this approach to different forms of Black nationalism, how they exist, how they coexist, how they may shape each other in different ways. And then also thinking about Black nationalism from the Pacific as well. So thinking about what Maori Black nationalism looks like, or what the Polynesian Panthers version of Black internationalism looks like. So this is sort of a second strand of interesting dynamics in terms of thinking about this more broadly about nationalism. And third, I think there's some useful developments in the history of emotions when we think about how not only communities cohere, but how nations cohere. What are the sort of useful emotional approaches to politics, to identity, and also, quite frankly, to belonging. So I think there's all of these sort of sects of approaches, and I caution myself in saying like a sort of an effective nationalism. I feel like yikes, we don't need another one. But there is something to be said about the sort of the usefulness of a history of emotions as a site for investigating more ideas about what nationalisms tell us, how they tell us, what they tell us about the character of nations, what they tell us about the style of nations, and how those nations are cohering in interesting, but also sort of unique ways. And so for me, I see those three sort of strands as really helping to inform my ideas about what I think diasporic actors can do. They're sort of they're cohering, they're engaging. I see them as intellectual and sort of emotional communities. They're tapping into this sort of third rung of the history of emotions. They're also talking about Black nationalism. They're borrowing tools and practices and symbols from Black nationalism. Sorry, can you guys now hear me better? Because I was like, oh. Yeah. And then they're also sort of talking about what white nationalism means in the German context, which does not necessarily want to talk about whiteness. You know, we mostly think about sort of whiteness through, we think about sort of the Nazis and Aryanness and what that means. And what I think it's interesting with sort of Black Germans as well as sort of other minoritized communities in the German context, they are talking about a super whiteness that emerges in the German context. That is basically an unspoken, normalized super whiteness that emerges. And this has connotations that take us back to the 19th century. And so they're really pushing these nice discussions of colonialism as helping, so as a sort of center of how whiteness becomes enshrined legally in the German context. So German national identity, German citizenship, all normalizes this sort of interesting form of super whiteness that then these communities are arguing against and sort of trying to confront and challenge. So I think there is where you can sort of see this sort of breakdown in terms of my own sort of trajectory with the scholarship.
Thanks, Tiffany. Oh, now I forget what I said, Alex or Nicole.
Let's let Nicole have the last word.
Okay, Alex, you go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, a really good question. So I would construct this in a way as a question of inside and outside, or thinking back to this morning's discussion of this inherent dialectic between national and internationalist, or nationalist and internationalist projects. So that is to say, how nationalism in one country often, maybe even always, is linked in both implicit and explicit ways to wider global nationalist projects. Just again, a thought about this morning. I mean, the recognition of national sovereignty, for instance, that anti-colonial movements struggled for, always entailed incorporation into internationalist bodies. That was your sign of membership in the world of nations, right? That's what gave you a seat at the UN, for example. That's what gave you a plane ticket to Geneva. So in this case, the idea of race, constructed as it may be, remains, I think, one of the key elements in allowing nationalism to transcend other borders: geographic, cultural, linguistic, religious. Speaking for myself, I continue to regard the 20th century showdown between racial and class internationalism, between fascism and communism, as of prime significance as these rivals battled to reconfigure nationalism along one pole or the other, with the bloodiest of consequences. That said, I personally continue to regard one end of that, race, as an invented category, and class as a materially grounded one. That's rather old-fashioned of me, perhaps, but I'm a labor historian. So perhaps the most promising new turn in the study of nationalism, oddly enough, and I think many of the remarks here suggest this, has been to decouple it as much as possible from the nation-state itself, which has unnecessarily delimited nationalism as an analytical category. Instead, we would do better, methodologically and in the terms of our guiding research questions, certainly, to recognize nationalism as a phenomenon prior to and even unbounded by the nation-state. Of course, the nation-state is one of the forms that nationalism has taken, but I see no good reason, and here I think this is what Nicole was saying as well, no good reason to see it as the teleological steady state of nationalist aspirations. and thus other forms or political imaginaries as merely variations or divergences from the natural endpoint of nationalism, i.e. the creation of a nation state. We need to decouple it from that particular trajectory. Thus, if one considers white nationalism in general and Afrikaner nationalism in particular as prior to the creation of a South African nation, for example, one can begin to see new things. Similarly, if one regards the the Confederate States of America as a perfectly logical outgrowth of American nationalism rather than some kind of aberrant, sharp diversion from it, one can begin to think more accurately about the Civil War and its ultimate resolution, the outcome of which was far more of a reconfiguration of white nationalist aspirations than their repudiation in the 19th century. And finally, just a few things that Tiffany said about white nationalism reminded me of this. I mean, there's been fabulous scholarship over the past 2 decades about black internationalism and its intertwined nature with the civil rights and black power movements, and that has in turn forced us to see those as twinned movements rather than oppositional ones. There's been much less scholarship on white nationalism in the same period. But it only takes about 5 seconds, if you can stomach it, to go read the white nationalist press of the early 1960s, and Mississippians are all filled with fascination with what's going on in the Congo, in South Africa, in Rhodesia, right? They love Ian Smith. They love the UDI in 1965, right? So believe me, the segregationists in the American South in the early 1960s are paying every bit as much attention to international affairs as their rivals in the civil rights and black power movements. But there's been very little scholarship on that. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
White internationalism. Nicole, go ahead.
Yeah, I would first pick up on something that Tiffany said about the sort of political frameworks for applications of the history of emotions, which I think is super interesting. And I think at least 2 of us here today were also at a recent workshop on the anti-colonial transnational solidarity, and there the organizer, Jared Hawley, asked me about the difference between the political affect of political solidarity versus sympathy, and what distinguishes the two and how they function. And in terms of race and nation, affect is very interesting in terms of tracking from the national to the international, to bridging a kind of solidarity, and to reaching a kind of transnationalism. But again, I haven't figured out sort of, affectively what's the difference between sympathy and solidarity. So I'll just put another sort of comment or question out there about that. So in my response to this, I kind of want to focus, I think, on the second part of the prompt on the historiography of race and nationalism in light of the recent revival of nationalism in an Asian context, because I think a central premise links our present global nationalist moment with the global anti-colonial nationalist moment that I studied in the late 19th to early 20th century, that the historiography of Asian racial nationalisms have something to say about. And this link between then and now is basically a contestation of a single globalized international system. And as Jamil Aydin is here has shown, the legitimacy crisis of the prior international imperial system produced the pan-Islamic and pan-Asian ideologies of the period through non-Western elites' encounter with European exceptionalist narratives and racial barriers that circumscribe their application of Enlightenment ideals, and how that delegitimized that Eurocentric world order. And long before the post-1945 anti-colonial movement, this impelled Asian intellectuals to construct a more inclusive concept of global civilization, including an alternate discourse of race. And this formed the ballast of many anti-colonial nationalist projects in Asia. And today's global moment of retreat into national units in some ways is a telescoped inverse of that prior moment's Asian globalization and proliferation of the nation-state form. And the historiography more recently on East-East intellectual and material connections charted this creation of a more politicized version of Asia, and the shifted focus to East-East and trans-periphery and intra-global South histories has allowed us to appreciate more clearly this legitimacy crisis, as well as to see the globalization of the nation-state form and its attendant proliferation of nationalisms as something other than merely defensive or derivative phenomena, though those aspects were also present. As Adam Gelchu and other people's work has shown, there's positive political imagining and world-making underway. With a few exceptions, the nation-state in Southeast Asia was largely an elite, or at best, anti-colonial tool. During the independence revolutions, elite leaders in Southeast Asia insisted that the modern centralized nation-state be implemented immediately within imperial borders. And the imperial nation-state form ensured the success of anti-imperial arguments and groomed Western educated imperial elites simply to replace one elite ruling group with another, while keeping existing structural borders in place, delaying potential ethnic struggles for nationalist inclusion. And while many aspects of this formula obtained elsewhere in the decolonizing world, the striking feature in Southeast Asia is how few attempts there have been to redraw the artificial multi-ethnic imperial borders, instead largely taking the imperial constructions as ready givens for authentic post-colonial nation-states. And the nation-states created out of the Southeast Asian imperial landscape are in certain respects empires dressed up in new nation-state garb. But for the current new nationalisms to surmount this elite nature of Southeast Asian, the Southeast Asian nation-state form, they have to address these postponed questions of ethnic inclusion, which is why populist nationalisms in the region can look very different than they do in the West, often flowing from a majoritarian ethnic elite against an internal minority rather than a nativist guard against globalized entanglements and foreigners. And they've been around for much longer in the region. And so in terms of how the Asian racialization of nationalist thinking has affected methodological nationalism and our understanding of this nationalist revival, the Asianist thinking of the pan-Asianists I talked about before ended up reviving toward the end of the 20th century in reaction to the heavy-handed modernization theory and positions of the 1960s and 1970s, and alongside the Asian miracles of the same period. Lee Kuan Yew, Mahathir Mohamad, and the People's Republic of China instrumentalized and propounded Asian values, admonishing the West's excessive individualism and transtemporalizing Asia to claim an embedded modernity, such that deviance from a unilinear path of Western modernity was something other than, a regression. And what had been gained in the interim between the anti-colonial and the post-colonial Asianist nationalisms was an eating away of the Manichaean dichotomies of East and West, even as a dialectical relationship continued to undergird them. And then after the whole end of history debate, pundits sort of heralded the coming Asian century, and spiritualist or collectivist Asia's kind of prescriptions for world order returned to bookshelves and continued to, but this time with a more inclusive world stage, because now this Asian future that in the prior moment was for Asia has in Asia alone. It's for the whole globe, essentially. And of course, more rigorous versions of this kind of conversation that happened amongst pundits also obtained in the academy, where Prasen Jatwara and others, Huan Xingqian in his work Asia's Method, removed Asianist Asia's narrow racial remit and historicized and interrogated it as a coherent region and took seriously its potential epistemological and methodological offerings. And the global trend in history, of course, had a sophisticated debate on alternative and multiple modernities, though that sort of petered out and didn't go anywhere because of our failure to define modernity conclusively. But so this century of Asianist thinking has done, I think, the most work to our understandings of modernity and civilization, while seemingly removing race itself as an urgent category of analysis within Asian nationalisms. Unfortunately, in Southeast Asia, goals of racial emancipation have been set aside. There's weakening international institutions, regional commitment to non-intervention in national affairs, and sapped international zeal. So there's nobody left to police the nation-state form in Southeast Asia, where deferred ethnic struggles are instrumentalized toward political consolidation. And religion and ethnicity feature increasingly as state instruments in the region, whether to shore up power or popular support. And we should note that though resource distribution may have ethnic dimensions within nation states, globally they follow class lines. And unfortunately, across Southeast Asia, resource distribution often undergirds the exclusionary aims of the new nationalisms. So race seems to have receded as an urgent category within the constitution of nationalisms in Southeast Asia. And that raises the question about the presence of the global within past and current nationalisms, which were once so very vitally bound to contestations of the imperial international order, like we just mentioned. So race once crucially informed world making and helped explain away the ledger and that social Darwinist competition. But today, race appears relevant in Southeast Asia's nationalisms only as an anti-colonial artifact or for subterranean anti-imperial potential. CUUNJIEng Chen's formulation of Asia as method was also an attempt to move forward on the problematic, as he put it, of decolonization, de-imperialization, and de-Cold War. So even here, it seems that broad Asian race as a referent for national struggles is tied to the imperial qualities in conditions of global knowledge production. So the afterlives of empire and imperialism within Asia and Asian nationalisms may be what brings out most forcefully, and the sort of persistent dreams of constructing alternative modernities and subjectivities to break from a single Eurocentric world order.
Thanks, Nicole. So we've now come to the kind of open discussion part of the panel, the roundtable. So if anyone has a question, you can feel free to raise your hands, or you can also type them online if you're online. We have a question here, and maybe while you're walking over, Tiffany, did you want to respond to Alex's point, and then we'll go to you.
Alex, it's a great point. I see a lot of cooperation among South African expats and Black Germans in the West. So they're also helping with a variety of like cultural literary journals. So there was an African student association that was formed in which they produced a literary journal that incorporates a variety of other African expats from Nigeria, Ghana. They're working in a large sort of Black Germans are working also in a large South African apartheid movement in West Germany, which I just gestured to in the book because that's its own book in itself. So there is a lot of cooperation among African expats, of which South African expats are a part of that community. And it's actually those conversations with African, Ghanaian, Nigerian expats that have really helped to push Black German mobilization in the mid-1980s. So oftentimes there's a discussion about the sort of beginning, the spark of the Black German movement in the 1980s in Germany is sort of tied to Audre Lorde, who is an Afro-American feminist. But in actuality, it's actually a lot of these African expats who are based in Berlin, who are a part of these subcultural movements, subcultural movements that are very much tied to Pan-Africanism. They're sort of a part of theater groups. So this is a larger milieu that Black Germans are a part of which South African activists are a part of. In the East German case, I had hoped last summer to do more research on Black German organizations in the East, and what that looked like. What were the sort of activities that they formed? I'm only sort of getting some cursory materials that I see in which they're engaging with South Africa, but how and why and who are their connecting actors? I don't know as much.
Well, the Stasi might have kept a tight grip on their comrades. But there's lots of stuff in the Stasi papers, I've been told, about South Africans in East Germany. So I'd be curious what you find when you get to go look.
Thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
I think the whole question of race is far more foundational to the history of nationalism than the three questions which were set to the panel actually would suggest. Modern politics, after all, were born racialized in the early modern period. If we're to follow the kind of work of someone like Charles Mills, who very sadly I heard yesterday is now terminally ill. If you look at the kind of the ways in which political personality is constituted both in ideological terms, but also in terms of the practical engagements of civil society, with forms of exclusions. Which are racialized, and these are foundational to what comes to be that body of political thought of European nationalism at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries. And this means that really, if one's looking at the history of nationalism, that throughout its trajectories from the late early modern period through to the contemporary period, there have always been three overlapping dimensions. First of all, the question of race operating within political society, a bounded territorial political society, race operating across political societies which are geographically linked or otherwise, and race as constitutive of the international system. And that these three aspects of race have been continual framing factors for the constructions of forms of nationalisms. And just to give you some concrete examples of this in the literature, I mean, if you're looking at something like what I consider to be one of the kind of great books of global history of the last 20 years, Marilyn Lake and Henry Reynolds' Drawing the Global Colour Line. I mean, that's a book which is about nationalisms as they emerge in Australia, South Africa, the United States, elsewhere in the Anglo world. But it's also about the ways in which this is connected to a history of racialization, which is both contemporary, but also has this longer lineage. If one's looking at the kind of history of Caribbean politics in the 20th century, there's a convergence of forms of internationalized, either Pan-Africanism or indeed taking the practical form of Garveyism in the interwar period, together with forms of nationalism. So the boundaries between the kinds of questions we looked at earlier on really don't exist. And really the question of race is constitutive of many of these engagements of internationalism and nationalism. And I think we need to remember always that we're talking about nationalism, but we must remember that nationalism was always a tool being used to negotiate particular things. Political agency within societies, political agency across international societies, engagements with resources, engagements with the benefits of the social state, to use that construction, however it's operating in a society. And in all of these terrains, race has been explicitly, or more often implicitly, an absolutely central dimension.
Can I respond to that question that wasn't a question, Richard? So yes, I couldn't agree more, and I'm glad you referenced Drawing the Global Color Line, which indeed is the book I constantly had in the forefront of my mind as I was writing these remarks. But you've made me think of another angle here, and that's what one might call not the racial contract, but the racial alibi, right? And the racial alibi operates by mystifying exactly what you've just said. So that American nationalism, the North constantly used the racial alibi. Well, the South, the Confederacy, that's an exception to the main trajectory of American nationalism, which is non-racialized. Again, this is what's being re-upped by the 1776 alleged rebuttal to 1619. And certainly in international post-war politics, South African apartheid was the great racial alibi for the West, even with all the support the West actually gave South Africa, but through rhetorical denunciation, whether it emanated from Geneva, from Washington, from London, from Paris, wherever, that allowed that racially based nationalism and international system of which it was constitutive, as Richard's suggesting, kind of to get off the hook. So I think that's an important element of this that I hadn't thought of until your remarks, Richard.
Thanks. Nicole, did you want to add anything?
Not at the moment.
Tiffany?
Yeah, Richard, I think you made great points. I'm sorry to hear that Charles is not doing well in terms of that. Sort of that concept is so instrumental in how people are articulating larger dynamics about sort of everyday politics on the ground.
Tiffany, can you get the mic?
And the mic, sorry. So I agree with Richard. I don't disagree with him at all. I also said that I was sad to hear that Charles is ill. His concept of the racial contract is sort of central to how we think about whiteness. And also thinking about Tyler Stovall's new book about whiteness and freedom and liberation and those implications. So I wholeheartedly agree. I also wonder about, and this made me, based on the sort of conversation right now, just made me think about anti-racist movements in particular in the interwar period. So thinking about Garvey, thinking about Amy Ashwood Garvey, thinking about Free Ethiopia, the implications of that, and these larger discussions about nationalism that like I completely forgot to mention in my discussion. Sort of what place does that have as a new articulation for seeing the entanglements of internationalism, quite frankly, but also nationalisms. So I think there's something to be said about sort of going back to the interwar period and thinking about reimagining and reconceptualizing ideas of anti-racism, because oftentimes for sort of historians of the late 20th century, they see the 80s as a sort of hotbed for intersectionality, or it's really the 1930s and the 1920s as a hotbed for intersectionality, even though the concept wasn't sort of, are clearly articulated as such, but the demands were pushing for this type of intersectionality. So there's something about the interwar period globally that allows us to really rethink nationalism's plural and internationalism's plural. So I'll leave it at that. Sorry.
Other questions?
I think one thing I do want to say.
Go ahead.
I absolutely agree, Richard, with everything you said. In fact, I was furiously writing it down. And it's very constitutive to the way that I think about international is through race, as well as also ideas of the nation in the historical actors that I study. It is very much tied to larger constructions of race. However, I also want to, I think, push back a little, I guess, in terms of thinking about when does race or teasing out whether, in terms of a political society, race becomes a more predominant constitutive dimension when attached to nation. Because prior to an ascendancy of nation, it's not clear to me that race is the motivating or primary kind of exclusionary dimension. And religion and other forms of civilization still seem to me, I think, to have greater purchase, and that there is a genealogy there. And I think something special to nation with regard to race.
Thanks, Nicole. Yes, we have a question.
Yes, Aline Helg from the University of Geneva. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. And I was wondering how you would deal with nations that are multiracial, but in which the issue of racism is hidden or almost prohibited. And I had in mind Cuba in France, because there are quite a few similarities between the two. First, there are two nations in which you have a very centralized, strong, implicitly white-dominated government. At the same time, a sort of I would say will to declare the issue of racism resolved. For Cuba, it's with socialism, and I can cite you texts for that. And in the case of Cuba, it's the Republic and universalism, when both have, in fact, a long history of racism, colonialism, and so on, and multiracial society that are far from equal. And I was wondering how you would deal with them, and with also the subtleties with which they kind of treat their minorities, in the sense that because the issue of racism is no more existent, supposedly, then they cannot organize to challenge racism, which makes it very difficult. And in the case of Cuba, you cannot even talk about being Afro-Cuban anymore. You have to be color cubano, the Cuban color. Or in the case of France, it's communitarism as soon as you decide to mobilize on racial or religious line. And at the same time, because there is this sense that, the nation is not really, you have to pay lip service to the minorities. And I couldn't, I have to share with you this, I don't know if you know that the Cuban mission to Angola, military mission, was called Operación Carlota. And Carlota was the name of an enslaved African woman who was executed during a slave rebellion in Cuba. But it was really externalizing the problem. At the same time, you probably have heard that Josephine Baker has just been contemporarize, and it's also another way to sort of pay lip service to the issue of race, but it's so convenient that she's African American and not born in France. So I was just wondering how you would deal with this issue. Thank you.
I mean, Tiffany, to me, this just comes back to what you said about Germany, it being equal under the law, right? So an official kind of negation of the problem. I don't know if you want to jump in here or
Well, I can briefly
Okay.
speak to the Cuban case, although, Eileen, I doubt I'm saying anything you don't know. I mean, you answered your own question, but my sense is, as not a specialist in Cuban history, but in terms of the Southern African adventure, that's precisely what was going on, that this was an internationalist mission in the name of both proletarian solidarity, but also racial solidarity, and Fidel, crafted it that way quite deliberately, but that had as much to do with internal Cuban politics, I presume, in the 1960s in terms of discontent amongst Afro-Cubans as it did with internationalist commitments. Now, try and tell that to a South African, and they'll laugh at you. They don't believe that. And again, I mean, this played out with the diaspora in the United States as well, where there was an attraction on the part of some African Americans to the Cuban experiment precisely on these grounds. The most interesting, this is just a very brief anecdote, I used to live in Miami. The most interesting lecture or debate I ever went to was when we had Carlos Moore, who was a major Afro-Cuban critic of the failure of the Castro regime to deliver on promises, debating Amira Baraka, who even well into this must have been the 1990s, even the early 2000s, Baraka was an ardent defender. Yes, it must have been the early 2000s, because I got into it with him about Mugabe in Zimbabwe. So, but he's still, 2001, ardent defender of the Cuban Revolution on Pan-Africanist solidarity terms. So those sort of international connections are quite interesting. But Eileen, I'm sure this doesn't come as news to you. But again, to my mind, this suggests that notion of, we can't understand nationalist identification without its internationalist projection.
Yeah, I think that's, especially for the French case, I'm really intrigued by the inclusion of Josephine Baker. On the one hand, it's like, okay, overdue in some respects. On the other hand, it's sort of Jeanine Vallée is ignored. So someone who is a part of the sort of underground, the French resistance movement, who then went on to become a French politician, that she's not in the pantheon. So that says a lot about the sort of French hierarchies that are in place in terms of subjects of African descent, in which the subjects who are from the African descended subjects who are from the U.S. are really higher on this sort of ladder of recognition and attention. And so certainly individuals who are part of the West Indies or part of the French colonies were unable to acquire that degree of attention. And so you still see that. And I think that her inclusion of the Pantheon is an example of that. But there is this great new scholarship, I sort of label it Black French scholarship, that's really talking about why a variety of Black women were used in the 19th century, so for France to reimagine itself after the loss of its Saint-Domingue, that they use Black women, Sarah Bartman, and a variety of other Black women to really renegotiate who they are as a nation, and also to police white French women's sexuality and their bodies. So I think you see that sort of new scholarship pushing what ideas of liberation mean in the French context, what ideas of liberation mean in a variety of geographic regions in the French Empire. So I think you're absolutely right that how the French see themselves is not necessarily how their sort of former French colonial subjects saw them. And you see that challenge to the sort of universalist ideas of republicanism, in which we're all equal, we're all espousing these views of égalité, fraternité, and liberté, and the reality is no, we're not, and we never have. Even the sort of project that helped to form the sort of French Republic was exclusionary, and remains so. In the German context, you also see that in terms of how African Americans were perceived on both sides of the wall. So how East German officials really tried to push for solidarity with African Americans, also other socialist groups across the globe. It was certainly a part of their international solidarity politics, which was actually called an international solidarity politics, and how they shaped their character on the international scene. And in the West German case, you also see that sort of why was there so much focus on the Free Angela Davis campaigns on both sides of the wall. There's something to be said about that, as opposed to thinking about Black Germans who are going to university in the 1960s and 70s, or to think about Somali students who are going to universities in West Germany. So I think there's a deliberate push for race to be an American export. And it's a sustained dynamic in Europe, sadly, which is why I mentioned that on the European continent, race is so hyper visible while it's also so invisible. Like they coexist, and that's how they approach their multiracial others in many ways, and then mapping on of difference to those multiracial groups. Sorry, that was a bit long than I anticipated.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Nicole, did you want to add anything to this one?
All I wanted to say was to actually echo what's been said just before about the role of the diaspora, because at least in a nation context, I think that's what makes clear what can be invisible or invisibilized within the nation state, both on two counts. One is through sort of networks and solidarities outside that bounded space that allow you, like, give you some of the tools to organize and mount the challenges that you can't internally, but also on the flip side, when the presence of racism doesn't come from the political, or the declared absence of racism or solution to, having resolved racism doesn't come from the political project, but actually comes from a just sort of assumption due to a largely undiverse society, or a less diverse or a less multicultural society. So there can be an assumption that there is no racism present because there's much less mixing. The diaspora also pierces that.
Thanks, Nicole. Question, Michael, go ahead.
I had a question which maybe makes me the victim of my own conference, and it has to do with the capaciousness or narrowness or specificity of our categories and nationalism in particular. Maybe Nicole already gave the answer to it in her reply to Richard, but I wonder what exactly we mean by nationalism now. I think Sandrine said earlier, not everybody who thinks in terms of the nation state necessarily is a nationalist. You, Alex, now almost said the opposite. You don't even have to want a nation state in order to be a nationalist. I was also struck by the fact that both you two opened with disclaimers that you're not students of nationalism, and yet it sounded almost to me as if the word nationalism and nationalist was mentioned most often in this panel, more than in the others, right? So we have white nationalists, we have black nationalists. With white nationalism, I always thought, why don't you just call it racism? What's the added benefit of calling them nationalists? Yes, of course, it refers to the idea of having a racist, white supremacist nation, but in a certain sense, in the modern condition of a world being divided into nation states, every political claim rests somehow on an idealized form of what I want my nation to be, right? So I can say I would love to have a Germany that is like that. Does that make me a German nationalist, right? And then we have Afrikaner nationalists. So basically, in your rendering of South African history, there were no non-nationalists in the story, right? The ANC, there were non-racialist nationalists. Everybody's just differently nationalist somehow at the end of the day, right? So I guess my question is, what is are there any non-nationalists left in our story? Is there danger in this conference that
that's your
we walk
problem,
out of
Michael.
this, everybody's a nationalist, right?
What about the anarchists? No?
Yeah. All right.
Does anyone want to tackle that?
I mean, one of the things that struck me this morning is, of course, I think the truth is that most human beings at most times have identified their primary affinities with the local, right? And that to think of yourself in terms of the history of emotions or the affect as someone who belongs to a nation is probably unusual in an overall span of time and place in history. So I don't know what one wants to do with that, but I mean, we organized the conference around the concept of nationalism, which in fact is quite an unusual state of affairs, I think. But how to respond directly to that, I don't know if I have a good answer. I mean, it's a good challenge. I mean, one of the things about Afrikaner nationalism that was and is so interesting is that it was, isolationist, shall we say. It was based on this imagination that somehow there could be a South African nation that was only white people, even while it materially couldn't exist without black labor. And so, you know, there might be two forms of competing ideas here, one which is one of racial domination attached to the state, but the other is racial retreat and isolation. So there are plenty of white nationalists in the United States who imagine that their ideal future is like a tiny piece of their own private Idaho, right? And they're going to retreat there. Well, there are others, like, you know, Donald Trump, who imagine that the nation itself can be rebuilt as a white nationalist project whereby white people are privileged and it's like apartheid and everyone else is dominated. And those are actually very different visions, I think. Now, you know, how to understand those within this larger structure of nationalism, that's the theme of the conference, I don't know, but they can and should be analytically distinctive, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Michael. I don't see Black Germans as Black nationalists, though. I certainly think that they're using some of the tools of like Black nationalism from the African American case, actually from, you know, they're borrowing from Garvey, they're borrowing from Malcolm X, they're borrowing from, you know, the British Black Panthers as well, but they're not necessarily rooted in a Black nationalist framework in the same way as I would say for the Black French case or the Black British case. I think it's much different for Black Germans. I think they're using a variety of tools, diasporic tools and resources to make demands about who they are and where they are on this sort of larger scheme. We're both German, but we're also internationalists because we're connected to this global Black diaspora. And so I think it's much more their sort of Black nationalism becomes a concrete tool for Black Germans to sort of read, to theorize who they are, rather than sort of articulating a Black German version of Black nationalism. That being said, you do have some Black Germans who were Black nationalists, I think in the beginning, in which they saw themselves as being like a new incarnation of like Malcolm X, you know, and they're sort of wearing dashikis and sort of also, you know, the performative aspects of Blackness that sometimes come along with that. But then there was also pushback against, like, this is not how we want to be seen as an organization. And so I think there's maybe sort of individual case studies that will help us tease out, like, the place of Black nationalism within this larger discussion of Black Germanness and German activism. But as a whole, the movement and as a whole, they weren't all Black internationalism.
So just to add, in terms of the South African context, there's a huge chunk of whites who might not be nationalists, and that's the English-speaking whites who would prefer to remain as part of the Commonwealth. That's 50% of the referendum, 48% of the referendum in 1961, right? About whether South Africa will become a republic, which is the ideal of the Afrikaner nationalists, or remain part of the British Empire, essentially. Now, this isn't to say that they were not racist. They certainly were, but they had the racial alibi of the white nationalists, but they were not white nationalists per se. Their attachment was to either the empire in a non-racial imagination or to sort of liberal values broadly painted. Again, that were defined but by whiteness to a certain degree, but not explicitly. But I would say those folks in the South African context were not nationalists. Their main commitment was to a different set of ideals.
Nicole, did you want to add anything? Okay, more questions. Oh, we've got the microphone already here.
Okay. Following up on what Michael just asked, I think you got to be careful not to slip into the treating nationalism as a synonym for solidarity, so that if we're talking about black or white nationalism, we sometimes do talk that way. All we're really talking about is solidarity with people who see themselves or purport to see themselves as being members of the same race. And we sometimes talk that way, but analytically, if it's going to be a category that's sort of more interesting, we want to keep keep nationalism and nation somewhat distinct from race, precisely and racial solidarity, precisely so we can investigate all of these connections, which everybody's saying so important. And so my question, or what I'm interested in, is what nation adds to race, or what national solidarity adds to race, what racial solidarity adds to national solidarity. The latter, what racial solidarity adds to national solidarity, we've got enough examples to figure that out. What national solidarity adds to racial solidarity, fewer examples, harder to see. The Afrikaner example is perfect, because here you obviously have racial solidarity, and then we're going to add on to it, as you said, a form of national solidarity based on this community understood as Afrikaner. But in the ordinary expression of white nationalism and black nationalism, the question is sort of responding back to what Michael brought up. Does the national part add something to the racial solidarity, and if so, what? And let's leave aside Marcus Garvey and the explicitly black nationalist movements looking for a national home. So that's my question. What in the white nationalist talk, black nationalist talk we talk about now, is there a national solidarity component that's added on to the racial solidarity component, and what is it?
Control of territory.
Maybe before we get into that, is there another microphone out? We'll just maybe take one more question and then do some final thoughts and then move on to the break as we're almost out of time. So one more there. Go ahead.
Sort of piggybacking on this discussion, and also Alex's point earlier about sort of racial alibis. There's also sort of a racial absence to a lot of the study of nationalism, which was, so I think, what was targeted in the first question. And there was a conference in 1962 at Birkbeck in London where Gellner and Hobsbawm were all there. And in the conference proceedings, which the conference was explicitly on colonialism and nationalism in Africa and Europe. Race is mentioned once. And so, I mean, I'm wondering, here we're sort of kind of closing this panel with discussions about what the racial modifier is doing to nationalism, or what the nationalist modifier may be doing to race. But what also was involved in these absence, this sort of a refusal to really engage the two topics, sort of in the field of nationalism studies, broadly construed, sort of in the more sort of traditional sense of Gellner, Smith, et al. And perhaps, I mean, here I am going to speculate instead of letting you answer, so apologies. But perhaps an element of this, it was involved in Alex and Tiffany saying, well, I don't really work on nationalism, and sort of how that may link to that kind of professional hesitancy.
Okay, I think we'll just collect kind of final thoughts before we move into the break on the last two questions or 2 points that were raised, and anything else you want to add before we go. Nicole, do you want to go first? Final thoughts?
I'm going to think for a long time about that question, which I think is really an important one, a crucial one, is nation and race. And I don't want to hazard a guess now, but I do want to think about it. So, yeah, I'm going to shortchange that question, I think, if I answer now. The first thing that comes to my mind, though, is about, I guess I have to go back to my, the active I study in Southeast Asia, and there's a sort of a way in which they're theorizing race through a kind of evolutionism that develops alongside climate and other specificities of place, and then carve into their concepts of race, already figured there a politics of place and a kind of attachment to place and an inalienability of place within the development, which makes the sort of historical imaginings and kind of temporalities and imaginations of the nation state a kind of easy carrier, I guess, to bring those things together. But that's the first thing it made me think of, but I don't yet feel like I have a good answer.
No worries.
So those are tough questions, and you know, well, I didn't invent the question about race and nationalism. Michael did, but yes, I mean, we do run the risk of collapsing the categories, which doesn't do us any good. So I'd come back to the question of control of territory, right? It doesn't have to be a nation state, but any racial nationalist movement worthy of its name does aspire to control some kind of territory. I mean, even the internationalist left, the Communist Party, saw this as a way of selling their program in the 1920s in the United States and South Africa, right, with the self-determination thesis. Whatever that's worth, that was a way of sort of squaring that circle of internationalism and black nationalism at the time, was by attaching it to some sort of aspirational control of territory, although never explicitly in the terms of nation states. So that's where I would rest it, and given our, and one can also think about the Middle East and Palestine in these terms as well as the central question, of course, in debates about that. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, these are really good questions. I think I'll start with this idea of sort of national solidarity, thinking about sort of Black Germans and their solidarity with other minoritized communities in the German context. So they're forging connections with Turkish German, Roma. They're all seeing a similar racializing project in the German case. So they're using this sort of national context for German racecraft and state building as a way to forge a racial solidarity, if that makes sense. And what's interesting about sort of the Black German mobilization more broadly is that they also adopt this sort of more inclusive term for Blackness, so that Black becomes a political signifier and a cultural signifier, much in the same way that it does in the British context. So they're able to try to have a much more inclusive movement that's really pivots around anti-racism in the German context. So they're using the sort of national context of German racecraft to then form racial solidarities in ways that are very fruitful for them. But I also think that there's some limitations to that approach in terms of the essentializing tendencies that emerge with an approach like that. And I, much like Nicole, there's so much more that I want to say about it, but I also think I need to ruminate a little bit more about what that means. And then thinking about just the sort of larger dynamics of diasporic activism more broadly, that you see that they're forming that sort of national and international connection is premised on a type of racial solidarity, but that's not ignoring some of those sort of national specificities that are particular to, say, Afro-Cubans or Afro-Costa Ricans, who are also oftentimes from Jamaica, who then form families in Costa Rica. So Eileen, you would certainly know about this. But I think we need to be attentive to some of those sort of national specificities in terms of multiple national specificities that are emerging in some of these contexts. And the same case can be said for Black Germans who are of Guyanan or Nigerian and German descent. So there are multiple nationalities, national identities associated with some of those individuals. I'll leave it at that.
Well, I think we have a lot to think about for the next panels. I mean, now I wonder whether we can in any of the panels not think about race, if it is kind of constitutive, right, of many of these subjects that we're thinking of, and thinking about what the difference is between nationalism, racial solidarity, or other forms of solidarities, or internationalisms within the nationalism, as Tiffany kind of left us with on this last point. But for now, we have a break, so I guess we will be back here at 4? At 4 o'clock, and I don't know where people can, is there a coffee somewhere, or?
Yeah, it's in the cafeteria.
In the cafeteria.
Upstairs,
Okay.
everyone are invited to join us upstairs in the cafeteria.
So back to the cafeteria if you'd like a coffee, and thanks very much to the panelists and to everyone for your comments.